Welcome to this short interview series highlighting the key findings of a joint MERICS European Chamber of Commerce in China report, Decoupling, Severed Ties and Patchwork Globalisation. My name is Grzegorz Stec and I'm a MERICS analyst focusing on EU-China and Central and Eastern Europe-China affairs. For this overview of trade decoupling trends, I'm joined by Caroline Meinhardt, analyst at MERICS, and by Jacob Gunter, Senior Policy and Communications Manager at the European Union Chamber of Commerce. Caroline, Jacob, it's a pleasure to welcome you here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Let's start our discussion by talking about critical inputs. Caroline, can you tell us what exactly critical inputs are and why are they so important in discussion about decoupling?
So in this study, we've defined critical inputs as those kinds of inputs that are crucial for companies' production, but for which alternative sources can't be easily found. So many companies depend quite heavily on the steady supply of a whole variety of specialized raw materials, technical components, or manufacturing equipment, where even small disruptions can disrupt entire operations or industries because alternatives are too costly, low quality, incompatible, or simply not available in the first place. One of the most prominent examples is, of course, semiconductors. Semiconductors are critical components in a variety of high-tech industries, but also they themselves rely on specialized equipment and design software, and the production of which are often dominated by just one or two companies in the world. And so the series of US export controls that we've seen unfold over the past months and years have left European companies caught in the middle. So far, these measures have not amounted to a full-scale decoupling, and so many European companies say that they've not been affected directly, and many export controls are in fact quite narrow in scope. But the companies that we did interview are quite concerned about the future trajectory, especially when it comes to export controls, because it can take just one missing component or piece of equipment to essentially disrupt a company's entire China operations. And even though for many companies this seems like quite a far-off scenario, talk by the US government to further tighten export controls, for example, by lowering the current threshold of US origin content, also called the de minimis rule, these kinds of talks really worry European companies. And the pandemic-related supply shortages gave us a sort of preview of what that could mean in the future. So towards the end of last year, European car makers were facing chip shortages because chip makers in Europe and the US, which were operating with limited production because of the pandemic, were struggling to produce enough top-end inputs. And that was affecting these car makers' operations.
So in your view, are the European companies mindful enough of the vulnerability related to supply of their critical inputs?
So the European companies that we spoke with are mostly quite aware of the challenges. After all, they have experienced and learned to deal with significant supply chain disruptions in the wake of both the US-China trade conflict and then more recently the pandemic. And so the vast majority of our interviewees say that they have audited their supplies to assess risks related to critical inputs. But we did find that many companies haven't conducted detailed supply chain reviews that go beyond their most immediate supply lines. Some companies might not see any immediate risks to their own critical inputs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that disruptions can't still affect them indirectly if their second, third, or even fourth-tier suppliers can no longer source components or equipment from abroad. And if you look further downstream, there could also be issues. Let's say your customer loses access to critical inputs and is no longer able to produce all of their products, then that could mean that you yourself face a drop in demand for your own services or products from that customer. So what this means is that companies will really need to expand the scope of their due diligence efforts so that they can determine their level of exposure in the entirety of their supply chains and anticipate potential disruptions by coming up with contingencies.
And taking a look at the broader supply chain issues, the consideration for critical and strategically relevant goods has been further exacerbated by the pandemic. Consequently, throughout last year, discussions on diversification of supply chains gained momentum, and a large part of those discussions is focused on China. So, Jacob, how have the European businesses in China reacted so far?
Yeah, I think you're right that the pandemic kind of shone a light on perhaps over-reliance on China for certain things. Obviously, the PPE shortage and the near shortage that we had on pharmaceuticals, I think, drove a lot of concerns in a lot of capitals. Now, beyond that, though, we haven't really seen so much diversification or divestment out of China as what I think a lot of people expected or maybe anticipated. But for that, I think it's easier to break it down into sort of the natural diversification that's happening versus the trade war and the active efforts to drive European and foreign companies out of China. The natural diversification has been happening in any case, and it's mostly Chinese companies that are seeking lower labor costs in places like Southeast Asia. And that compares with the European investors in China who are mostly in China for China. And so when the trade war started for them, a lot of them actually benefited early on because they weren't so exposed, because they've already so heavily onshored. They want their suppliers to be in China for China as well. So they've integrated them locally for a long time. Now, otherwise, the supply chains, there were some minor adjustments here and there, but we saw that these bilateral tariffs didn't have the intended effect. That being said, we've actually seen a lot of further onshoring into China. European companies have sort of benefited from decoupling and the self-reliance campaign that's going on in China because they've actually been invited to further increase their investment here. So China's leaders are quite keen to get a lot of upstream technology and production into China as quickly as they can, while they can. So that's things like chemicals and machinery, basically all the things that are going to be necessary upstream for China's high-tech industry to be able to upgrade its production lines and to have access to the components that they need to create the best technology moving forward.
And have European businesses been affected to a similar extent, or have you noted any differences between different groups?
Yeah, there are definitely differences between different groups. That being said, I think it's a lot more interesting, rather than looking industry by industry, to actually compare company size. So the multinationals proved to be really resilient compared to the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs. This is essentially because bilateral tariffs turn out to be pretty easy to dodge if you're a multinational company. It's relatively easy to say, okay, instead of taking a 25% hit across the U.S.-China border, we're going to take a 5% hit by importing, instead of from the United States, from our operations in Europe or in South Asia or somewhere else. SMEs didn't have that kind of flexibility, and they were much more likely to be hit and not be able to recover easily from it. So in many ways, I think that should be a call to action from the U.S. and Chinese governments, is that if you're trying to drive out the major players with something like 25% tariffs and bilateral tariffs in this global economy, you're not really going to achieve that. Instead, you're just going to be repeatedly kicking the little guy.
Thank you both very much for your great insights. And to all our listeners, please be sure to read the full report for a complete picture. You can find it on websites of MERICS and of the European Chamber. Thank you, and until next time.